Thank you, Andy, and thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to be back home. I like to say that even though I've left Ann Arbor, I'm still a very loyal Wolverines fan because my younger son won't let me forget that. So we're pretty obsessed about following and saying "Go Blue" every Saturday. All right, so what do I do here? Somebody, is that mine? It is or it isn't?
It's not.
No. Well, I'll tell you a joke. No. No, I'm actually very honored to be on the same stage with John and Jeff and other distinguished speakers. You've all been disclaimed and my conflicts have been disclosed, so we can move to the next one. Oh, how do I do this? This way? Okay. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about one portion of what in this discussion of learning healthcare systems, which is not just what we commonly think about, which is big data, and when we hear big data, we think about more observational use of data. But we, in medicine, obviously, we really like randomized trials. Randomization is like magic. It does all sorts of things. The person who does it doesn't have to be particularly smart, but if you do it, it gives you really, really great results. So it's like discovery of fire or whatever. It's one of these major achievements in human intellectual history, I would say. So we still want to use that, even in a learning healthcare system, in prospective clinical trials. And the idea is to do it within a pragmatic trial, and I'm going to talk about that. So what I will do is quickly talk about why it's important to do that and the kind of ethical tension it raises. I will lay out the options of resolving that tension and then speak very briefly about how would you do that. So I'm going to give you the possible solutions first and then, or results, and then talk about how one might get there. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because the emphasis on the pragmatic ideal is so prevalent within, I guess, modern medical culture in the States that it's not good enough to have drugs that we tested in a small group of people and we think it'll work in people who are 80 with diabetes and hypertension, but we never tested it, but we're going to do that. So we want to be able to avoid those kind of questions by testing it broadly in a very realistic way. And you can summarize it by saying that we want to do research that closely mimics the usual clinical operations so that your answers can be very useful to policymakers as well as clinicians. And of course, this goes with the kind of thing that those articles that Ray mentioned. Some people feel that by doing this, well, maybe we have to worry less about this distinction between research and clinical care, the ethical obligations of each. I happen to think that there is something to it, but we don't want to go too far thinking that way. So these trials are very important because we have many treatments in medicine and procedures that are A or B. Let's call them A and B. They're both pretty good. There could be more than two. Not knowing which is actually better, and it's reflected in the variations in practice and lack of consensus in the field. And these are very valuable clinical trials to do because, when I wrote this, B is new and it's 100 times more expensive. That was kind of meant to be a real exaggeration, but you all know that's not an exaggeration, right? It could be even more than that these days. One of the treatments could be very burdensome, but it could be also more effective. We don't have great data, but that's a suggestion. One might have all the rigorous data, but a clever company has marketed much better a very similar drug, so it's convinced the doctors that it's kind of the same thing, so people use that more than the drug that's actually used in clinical trials. That happens. And then this applies to procedures, surgical and otherwise. And there are many instances in medicine where still we do things because we've always done it. And, you know, like in the 60s, there was that one old study that showed that, and then we kept on doing it, kept on doing it. There have been some new studies, but we're not sure. We really haven't done a rigorous head-to-head trial. So it would be wonderful to know this. And, of course, from a policymaker's point of view, you can save lots of money if you really know which is better, and you do that first. Okay. So what's the problem? That all sounds terrific, right? And you can see why in a learning health system of the future, I'd say, if you can integrate the research and the clinical procedures, you could really come up with very usable data. Now, the problem is that the vision of this system, and you know, if I were designing a place where I could do these randomized trials, you would want to build it into the very framework of the system. So you have a program of series of trials, not just one-off. Because you have, hopefully, have set up a wonderful electronic health record system so that you really only have to use that for a lot of these outcomes. However, the problem is that if you use required to obtain traditional informed consent with those 10, 20-page forms, you have to sit down and have a conversation. It's really, it's not really conceivable how you could integrate that into the everyday clinic. You know, when I talk to my wife and goes, you know, couldn't you just take 5 minutes? She's a primary care pediatrician, so I said, you know, couldn't you do research? Just take 5 minutes and talk about the research study. And she thinks like, what are you talking about? It's like we're seeing 30 patients a day. It's like, you know, it's chaos. I mean, how are you going to do these kind of consents? So that's one of the most commonly talked about. That's what I'm going to address today. All right. So here's this intuition, though, maybe standard of care RCTs. And I want to say at the outset, I'm using standard of care RCTs as my shorthand. Other people might want to call them RCTs of accepted treatments, whatever. So let's just, I don't want to get into a whole debate about whether it's the right terminology. All right. But it has these features, right? The interventions are accepted, so-called standard of care. You can't blame the doctor for using it. Everyone will receive these treatments, whether you're inside the trial or outside the trial, right? What most doctors would say, yeah, that's what you do. And there's no special research measures if we've gotten to the point where the electronic records can really give us good primary outcome data. So, again, there's a strong intuition that the ethics of studies must somehow be different than usual. The question is, how different is it, right? Now, here's what I think is a nearly exhaustive list of options that we have. So when we determine whether in a proposed study, it's, number one, it is ethically acceptable to forgo or modify traditional informed consent. Let's say that's one option, right? That's the tension we have to, so we go one direction. So if we do that, and after thorough analysis, these are the kind of options we would have. This sub-list isn't exhaustive, but it gives you a feeling. You could use a shortened form, hoping that that will speed up the process and make things adequate enough. You could do a simplified opt-out. This is kind of specified in the recent European directive, the regulations for clinical trials, in which they do say for certain types of cluster randomized trials, you could do what amounts to essentially a verbal opt-out process. So after you inform them of the elements of informed consent. You could do a verbal consent. This is something that shorter verbal consent. This is something I've advocated for certain types of trials where after certain conditions are met, you could do that. And basically the idea is, you know, I'm a psychiatrist. I talk to patients and I go, well, we could try this drug. This is why I'm doing it. These are the potential side effects. You really don't need to take a lot of time to explain it. And I just document it in the electronic medical records. Or others have advocated, no, even that takes too much time. We can't do these trials using that. So what we can do is to massively advertise this, trying to create some cultural change. The convention itself gets changed so people accept general notifications and broad consent when they join the learning health system, right? You could do that. Or some people have argued, well, some of these studies are so benign that you don't even need consent. Now, on the other hand, suppose you say it's not ethically acceptable to forgo or modify traditional informed consent. Then what do? Well, you have a couple options there too. One is you could modify the trial, and maybe you'll be able to modify it to the extent to accommodate informed consent. And it's not what you wanted to do, but it's pragmatic enough. That's possible. In fact, I know that happens, all right? The other option is, well, it's great if we could do it, but if you can't get informed consent, looks like you either can't afford to do the study, or the scientific data you gather just isn't going to be worthwhile, so you can't do it. So I believe that this represents a nearly exhaustive list of options. But how do you get there? I said after careful ethical review, you could go to those options. What does this careful ethical review consist of? Well, currently, we do have, for not FDA-regulated clinical trials anyway, these criteria called waiver and alteration. I said forgoing or modifying. So waiving or altering the criteria for informed consent. And these actually, I believe, after having thought about this and written a couple of papers on it, it's really uncanny that people who wrote the Belmont report, it is somewhat dated, no doubt, but it's kind of uncanny how thoughtful that document and the regulations that came out of that period is, even for today. We obviously need some tweaking, but fundamentally, it really does give us some very good guide, and I would say it's the same for these. There are some things that we could debate, and hopefully we'll have time to do that, about what these criteria that are required to be fulfilled for waiver or alteration. But they consist of these factors. One, the research have to be impracticable unless you waive or alter the informed consent. And for the purposes of this discussion at this point, we're kind of assuming that kind of exists, right? Because I told you there is this tension. It has to be no more than minimal risk, and the waiver alteration doesn't violate rights and welfare of the subjects. And I'm going to skip the last one because that generally speaks to things like deception research. So the question is, let's start from the first one, the bolded one. Is the study minimal risk? Now, some people think that if two standard care treatments are being compared, since everybody gets what the doctors would have recommended, inside or outside, almost by definition, that's got to be minimal risk. I disagree with that, and I don't think you can really answer the question without doing a case-by-case analysis. I've actually done a kind of eye-glazing, people get very bored when I talk about this, but I refer you to our paper. We've tried to formalize how you would go about assessing the risk of these kind of comparative studies, randomized clinical trials. And there is a very systematic way in which you can go about it. And I think we pretty clearly show that you have to do these case by case. But let's say intuitively, this is from another paper I wrote with a colleague, in which you can see, just let's take this one, where you're comparing two FDA-approved anticoagulants in the emergency treatment of STMI. And the primary outcome is composite of some really serious clinical outcomes, like including death. The potential side effects you're evaluating are bleeding, complications. The benefits are reduction in mortality and serious morbidity. And you can see there are several of those. There are surgical procedures and so forth that are being compared. All of these, in theory, could be considered standard of care treatments that are being compared in the clinical trial. I just want to appeal to you intuitively that you have to think long and hard about each case rather than saying, oh, they're both standard of care, so they've got to be minimal risk. Now, the other criterion is, would foregoing or modifying informed consent violate rights and welfare of subjects? This is a weird kind of legalistic criterion, isn't it? I've always found this somewhat difficult to interpret, but this is true. Rights could be referring to other existing laws or regulations. Maybe the these regulations are saying, yeah, you can waive or alter informed consent, but make sure you're not violating something else by doing that. That's a reasonable interpretation. But there is this odd mention of welfare given the previous minimal risk condition, right? So that seems redundant. So I propose that we interpret this to mean something like this, which I think is intuitive, is, you have to think about what people are otherwise entitled to in terms of rights and welfare, okay, rights and benefits. So here we come to the issue of reasonable expectations that are key. All right. And my point is that in terms of these reasonable expectations is that the precise reason why we want to do these trials are often because they involve preference-sensitive decisions by patients. We don't know which outcome is best, efficacy, but they have different side effects. Those are, that's what the entire movement about shared decision-making is about. So to try to change the consent in that setting would be kind of an odd thing to do. All right. I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to skip my slide on impracticability. It is actually a complicated notion, but it will take me more than 30 seconds. So I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to end with this final point. And this speaks to what Ray brought up. I do not believe that learning health systems, even though the word learning is much nicer than the word human subject research, it doesn't really erase fully the research-treatment distinction, and we can have a discussion about that. What it does do is it makes the ethical distinction more challenging to identify, but also, we shouldn't forget this, it pushes the tension to the very highest levels of organization, because the institution itself now wants to integrate. And there's going to be pressures to erase that distinction between research and clinical. And I think it's important that this gets addressed. It may end up being incredibly beneficial in the end, but we do need to look at that. Thank you.